Okay, all right, I'll have to explain this to you. I'll have to explain it to you. Science almost relies almost entirely on inductive reasoning. They make a partial observation through their sense perception or collective sense perception, and then they generalize to the whole, that the whole operates like the part that they observe, right? That's the scientific reasoning. That's inductive reasoning. Now, conclusions using inductive reasoning cannot be logically necessitated. Do you understand?
People often point to the problem of induction, but what about the problem of deduction? Here's a quote from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Deduction will not take one usefully beyond the foundations of knowledge and justified belief. As Mill argued, there is a very real sense in which one doesn't advance one's knowledge significantly, employing a form of reasoning that takes one only to conclusions that were implicitly contained in the conjunction of one's premises. Likewise, John Searle makes similar remarks. If you think of deductive arguments, there is nothing in the conclusion that is not in the premises. The premise always contains more information than the conclusion. But when he considers scientific or inductive arguments, we go from evidence to hypothesis. In the case of induction, there is always more in the hypothesis than there was in the evidence. The basic idea is that we need induction if we want to go beyond our foundational beliefs. It's not that we can't learn using deduction, it's that all the information is already contained in the premises. Deduction can help us clarify information that's implicit in the premises, but it won't generate information.
The conclusion is not guaranteed. Are you there?
Yes, I was just muted, because unlike you, I let people finish.
Okay, Gary. So,
No, Gary.
When an atheist makes a global or a universal statement about how things work, they are doing so without any logically necessary means of reasoning. So when they are being arbitrary and inconsistent, when they object to belief in God because there's no evidence for God, an atheist cannot point to their sense perception as evidence of the uniformity of nature, because that would be begging the question.
That was what he was doing. That was he was pointing to. It's to the plethora of academic work that has been done. And
it doesn't matter, okay, Gary. What you don't understand is that in science they use inductive reasoning. Okay, now it doesn't matter whether the inductive conclusions are widely accepted or not. When you assert that something is the case, globally or universally, based upon inductive reasoning, that is, philosophically speaking, that is begging the question.
DD is confusing the circularity of justifying induction with an inductive argument, which doesn't try to justify induction with induction. Does an inductive argument beg the question? According to Walter Sinnott Armstrong, in his paper Begging the Question, to avoid begging the question, one's reason to believe the premise must be independent of both a. one's belief in the conclusion and also b. one's reason to believe the conclusion. Let's look at the argument that DD thinks is begging the question. 1. All observed A's are B's. 2. All A's are B's. Let's see if this inductive argument violates A or B. Does the argument satisfy A? Is one's reason to believe 1 independent of belief in the conclusion 2? The typical reason for believing 1 would be testimony. If belief in the testimony of 1 is independent of belief in the conclusion 2, then A is satisfied. If the reason we accept the testimony of 1 is because we already accept the conclusion 2, then the argument is question begging. Otherwise, it is not. Does the argument satisfy B? Is one's reason to believe 1, independent of one's reason to believe in the conclusion 2? Presumably your reason for believing 2 would be 1, and your reason to believe 1 is trustworthy testimony. So there is independence, and B is satisfied. Here's another example to clarify Senator Armstrong's criteria, and also to show how a non-circular argument can beg the question. 1. Either Obama wiretapped Trump, or 1 + 1 = 3. 2. It's not the case that 1 + 1 = 3. 3. Therefore, Obama wiretapped Trump. This argument isn't circular because the conclusion is not the same proposition as either premise, but it does beg the question because one's reason to believe premise 1 will be the same as one's reason to believe the conclusion 3. We're taking for granted that no one believes 1 + 1 = 3. On a final note, philosophers disagree on what circularity and begging the question consist in, which is why they write papers back and forth on it. I'm using Walter Sinnott Armstrong's paper, because it seems to be a good view. But, as far as I know, no philosopher holds to the view that DD does.
Okay, do you know what a theory is?
Did you hear? Okay,
I want to answer my question before
Do you know? You see, he doesn't. Gary does not.
You're not answering his question.
What I'm saying. He doesn't. He's. You see, this is what they do. Do you understand that if you make a globe? Okay, Gary, do you understand that if if I say all swans are white, because the swans that I have seen are white, is that begging the question?
No, it's based upon your experience.
Okay. You see the problem, folks, with people like Gary and Daryl is they simply don't know the basics in philosophy.
Right. You do know that I'm a Christian, right? Right.
I don't care what you
do know I'm a Christian.
I don't care. I don't care what you profess. What I am pointing out to you
I care because
you don't even understand the basics in philosophy.
I think blasphemy.
You're a Christian defending an atheist, huh?
Okay, Gary, if I make a global claim that I haven't globally observed, even collectively in humanity, is that begging the question?
He was going upon what we see.
I asked you a question. I'll repeat the question again.
Are you keeping interrupting me?
No, you're not
answering the question. No, you're not answering the question.
Okay. If one makes a global claim based upon a partial observation, is the global claim from a partial observation begging the question?
No.
Okay, you don't know what you're talking about. The answer is yes.
We do, because he's going to put the evidence that we have. Now, if you want to see evidence
you're stupid.
I'd love to see it.
Dude, you're stupid. Okay, I'm explaining it to you, and me explaining it to you many times over, you're still refusing to accept the plain facts. When you make a global claim based upon a partial observation, that the whole is like the part that you observe, that's begging the question. You just denied that. You don't know what you're talking about.
Let's analyze an inductive argument for induction, to see what kind of circularity is being used. 1. Induction has worked in the past. 2. Therefore, induction will work in the future. Various philosophers have pointed out that this is a case of rule circularity and not premise circularity. In a premise circular argument, the conclusion is equivalent to the premise. In the above example, 1 is not equivalent to 2, so it is not premise circular, rather, it is rule circular. In a rule circular argument we conclude that a certain rule of inference is correct, using that same rule of inference during the argument. The problem with rule circular arguments is that they could be used to justify obviously wrong inferences. Here are some examples to help clarify. On counter-induction, we infer from, so far all A's have been B's, 2. The next A will not be B. Here is an example of a rule circular counter-inductive argument. 1. Counter-induction has failed in the past. 2. Therefore, the next counter-induction will work. We're using the counter-inductive rule to infer that failures of counter-induction support that the next counter-induction will succeed. This next example is a rule-circular argument for affirming the consequent. 1. If affirming the consequent is valid, then 1 plus 1 equals 2. 2. 1 plus 1 equals 2. 3. Therefore, affirming the consequent is valid. Here, we affirmed the consequent to infer that affirming the consequent is valid. In both these examples, we are using a specific rule of inference on the way to validate that rule of inference. This should cast doubt on justifying induction with rule-circular arguments.
I'm well studied in the philosophy of science.
May God have mercy on your soul.